So as Gary said, I'm Brian Swackley. I'm a recent master gardener, but I've been gardening for a very long time. I planted my first bean plant outside my sister's bedroom window when I was 9 years old, and increased to a tomato plant or two, and then since Kathy and I have been married 41 plus years, we've had various gardens of different scale. And we started composting very early on, and we got really excited about it, especially after she became a master gardener, because we not only understood the practice of composting, but we began to see underneath the hood, if you will, the inner makings of the science and the biology and chemistry of what makes composting actually happen. And so hopefully some of what we've learned will be helpful to you. We're going to cover the basics, and I'm going to give you some hints that have worked for us and some helps that have worked for us as well. And I'm not going to get too much into the technical side, because composting can be simplified in how you do it, but the process of composting is complex. That should be, that can be daunting for people that are thinking about composting. You know, it's just too complicated. I'm not going to do it. I don't understand it. But I don't want that to stop you, and that's why I decided to put together something along this line of today's presentation, is to encourage people that are thinking about composting to realize they can indeed do it and be successful if they follow some basic procedures and understand a few of the principles scientifically, biologically, if you will. And so I'm going to touch on those, but I'm not going to get into the depth of that, because there's a lot of great resources that are out there that'll take you, no pun intended, into the weeds as deep as you want to go regarding composting. And so if you really want to understand more of composting beyond the basics of what I'm going to present today, by all means, explore the internet. Here's a few resources that I use putting together this presentation and that are available through, some of these are available through our own Master Gardener website. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to look at just composting in terms of household and turning garden waste and kitchen waste into a mulch or a soil amendment for a practitioner, for us at home. And there is a way of composting that's called cold composting. I'm not going to get into that. It's passive. Basically, you have a place where you can create a pile, and you add to the pile as you have material. And over the course of a year or so, you end up with some compost in some part of the pile. There's another process or another type of composting called hot composting, and that's what I'm going to touch on today. And that's where you take an active approach at managing the materials and creating from a waste product something of value. So why bother to compost? You can go down to the local store and buy a bag or more if you need it, or you can drive your pickup down to a landscape yard and have them load that up, or if you need to scale up, you can go to your phone or to your computer and order a truckload delivered to your place if you want it, if you need a soil amendment or a mulch. But there are some things to consider that might motivate you to begin composting. Maybe you're motivated by money. Maybe the thought of saving some money will turn the key for you to start composting, because soil amendments and mulches can be expensive, and taking garden and kitchen wastes and adding them to your garbage can add to your garbage rates, because all of a sudden you have a bigger garbage can, or you've got garbage bags sitting alongside of your garbage can, or maybe you say, well, no, that's all part of the garbage service. Well, that's not free. The garbage service is going to have to come up with the means to pick that up and dispose it, and they just spread that cost across all of the users. So there's money that can be saved by composting. Maybe you're motivated by doing something that's green or environmentally friendly, and composting certainly can do that. Here's just two of many reasons to think about why you may want to compost. It can reduce the need for chemical fertilizers, because using compost as a soil amendment can make available to your plants and to your garden additional nutrients and minerals. Or it can also reduce the methane emissions from landfills, and it can lower your carbon footprint. Or in this time of year, it can reduce how much gets burned up in a burn pile. And then composting can save water. And this is an interesting factoid I came up with just as I was putting this presentation together, that for every % of organic matter to a point that you can add, that's added to a cubic foot of soil, you add roughly a quart and a half of plant available water that can be retained. So said another way, you put compost into your garden bed, and that helps the soil to retain water that's put there by rain or by irrigation, and keeps it there available for your plant. It also, as a top mulch, can reduce the surface evaporation of water from the soil, and it can reduce the soil temperature of the surface, but it can save on watering. So I'll stop with that. And I like the idea that you can take something that's worthless or can cost you money to get rid of and add value to it. Yard waste and kitchen waste, at least, and this comes from the EPA, can comprise at least 20% or more of your household garbage. And that's pretty sobering when you consider how many households there are. And if you drive by a landfill, you can realize just how big that issue can become, and how we as individuals can do something to help with managing what happens with yard waste and kitchen waste. And then composting produces valuable organic matter for your soil while it reduces the waste that goes into the landfill or into burn piles. So composting adds value to your garbage. And then this is what really turns my crank, is composting helps you to grow an amazing garden and yummy vegetables. And that's my wife's hand with the fruits of some of our labor recently out of our garden last year or maybe the year before. So what can be composted? A lot of things can be composted. And you can compost your grass clippings, and now's a great time to consider that because everybody's starting to mow their lawns again. Maybe you have access to dairy, chicken, or rabbit manure, or maybe you can get it from a neighbor. And then your fruit and vegetable waste that comes out of your kitchen. Garden trimmings, if you're deadheading or pruning, or at the end of the season you have annuals that you're needing to dispose of, those can go into your compost. Coffee grounds and tea leaves. And then, of course, there's wood chips and sawdust and hay and straw and corn stalks and shredded newspaper. And shredded because if you just put in newspaper, it has a tendency to mat and just get slimy and ugly and be impermeable to water and air. And so if you're going to use newspaper or paper of any sort, consider shredding it. And then there's ground up tree and shrub trimmings, horse manure mixed with bedding, deciduous leaves, and legume hay. A couple of years ago, we went up to Toledo and found a farmer who had a bunch of pea straw, and we got 30 barrels or 30 bales of it, I believe, and used it over the course of a couple of years. And that was pretty good. It wasn't quite as effective as a food for the compost as I thought it might be, because it's more of a balance. It didn't have the higher nitrogen. But you'll see column headings on this table, and I'll come back to this table, but there's categories of compost, and there's green materials and there's brown materials, which are higher in carbon. The green are higher in nitrogen. Again, we'll speak to that in a little bit. Try not to get too technical and scaring you away. And then there's things that are balanced. Okay, here's a rule of thumb. I thought this was pretty helpful if you're going to use manures. So in general, if it's a predator species or carnivorous or something of that sort, don't use the manure from that. But if it's a prey species, whether it's sheep or chicken, goats, that type of thing, they're generally safe, especially in a hot compost. So what can be composted? And here's an example of our utility yard last fall as we were closing down the season. We had leaves that were all over the place on the yard and on the patio and different things. We had tomato plants that we took out of the garden. We had dahlias that we took out of our flower beds. We had grass that I was still mowing. And then I'm going to speak to the mulched leaves and the mowed leaves here in a little bit. And don't forget your kitchen scraps. We find it helpful to have a plastic container underneath the sink. There is a cover to this. But don't forget your kitchen scraps. This is particularly helpful for people that are on a septic system where adding this kind of thing down your disposer isn't a real good idea. It just adds way too much bulk to your septic tank. So if you're on a septic system, I really encourage you to not put your kitchen scraps into the garbage can, but put it, or down your disposer, but put it into a plastic container and take it out to your compost pile. Okay, here's something that I hesitate to tell you because I don't want too much competition out there, but particularly at Safeway, if you go to just a regular Starbucks, you may need to ask for it from behind the counter. But Starbucks generally saves their coffee grounds, their spent grounds, and they reuse the bag that the coffee beans came into, and they put their coffee grounds into there. And like at Safeway, there's a metal garbage can around the counter where they've got this sign that says free grounds for the garden. And when I was growing up, there was a appliance salesman down in the Tigard area in Oregon. His name was Tom Peterson, and he had a big full-page ad on the back of one of the sections in the Sunday paper. And he'd have all the appliances and everything, but he'd always say, and remember, free is a very good price, because he'd always have some kind of giveaway. So I often use that phrase. I love the fact that you can do something with something that's free. Okay, a few things that you shouldn't compost, and here's our dog Lassen in our compost bin last fall. He found the moist ground particularly cool on this day, and I was out there working, and he thought this was a good place to take a nap. But some things not to compost for various reasons. Don't compost dairy products. They create an odor and they can attract pests, as can bones and scraps from meat or fish, or lards, whether lards or oils or fats, and including peanut butter, I've learned. So don't compost that. And then I really recommend at this point, don't try to compost diseased or insect-ridden plants. Unless you have a really effective and efficient hot compost pile, you may have issues with those things surviving the compost process. And even some diseases and insects might survive 150 degrees. So if you have disease or insect-ridden plants, probably better to put those in a plastic bag and throw them away. And then there's certain weed seeds and certain weed roots and stems that might survive the composting process as well, especially if you have a cooler hot compost or if you're cold composting. So if you're uncertain and you've got weeds that have gone to seed, maybe take the seed heads and dispose of them someplace other than in a compost pile. Don't compost your pet's waste, including soiled cat litter. Now, if you have a pet sheep or a pet goat or something like that, that's different. But back to the prior slide. But especially dog and cat waste, don't compost that. It could contain harmful agents. And then in general, I find it a great practice. Just don't compost yard trimmings that are treated with chemical pesticides, because some might persist. Some could break down because of hydrolysis or sunlight or heat or things like that. But I choose, and it's recommended, not to use things that are treated with chemical pesticides. Okay, how to compost. Now, I apologize in advance. I'm going to get slightly technical here, but I'm trying to keep it just enough so that we understand some principles that will help as we go forward. And think of compost as a three-legged stool that needs air, food, and water. And this slide shows C to N, or carbon to nitrogen. And I'll speak to that in a moment. But compost needs three things: air, food, and water. Obviously, almost all microorganisms need oxygen. Now, there are some bacteria that can survive on sulfur or other types of gases. But in a compost pile, the microorganisms that we have in that pile are going to need oxygen. They're going to need water to survive, but not too much and not too little. Rule of thumb is your material should be damp, but not soaking wet. And if you took a handful and you squeezed it, it should feel or act like a damp sponge where it's moist, but you're not able to squeeze out the water. It may mean that you cover your compost pile. You might need to cover it when it gets wet, which means most of the time in this climate. So I choose to have, you'll see in a moment, a cover that we have on our piles. It may mean putting a piece of plastic over it, something of that sort. You might even need to cover it in the summertime because of heat causing excess evaporation. Probably not, but you might consider just what might happen over the course of a year, because you're going to need to manage the water to a certain degree. And remember, the little guys that are doing the work, the microorganisms, need to be fed, but give them a balanced diet. Back to C to N, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. Now, I love a good hamburger and French fries. In fact, right now my mouth is watering just a little bit looking at that picture. But if I did that all the time, every day, and that's all I ever ate, I would struggle with my health and my appearance, but I wouldn't be a very healthy person if that's all I ate. So you want to give your compost pile a balanced diet. Now this is just a word picture of the point I'm trying to make. There's many tables that are out there that will show you what that C to N ratio is. Again, a little bit technical, but this is the percentage in a ratio of how much carbon to how much nitrogen there are in various materials that you might compost. And to be balanced, to give your compost pile a balanced diet, you're targeting a ratio of about 30 to 1, and that really is a variance around that. But be thinking about kind of a 30 to 1, and if you look at this area of the chart, there's a couple materials here that can be right in there, and if that's all you composted, if you gave it the right amount of water and kept it aerated, they'd probably do just fine. But you have other things that are extremely high in carbon compared to nitrogen, and you have other things that have a better amount of nitrogen versus how much carbon there is. So you need to use these kind of materials to balance against the materials that are at the upper part of the chart. Now, that's technical, right? So you'll see, I said, also known as brown and green. Think of the top part of this chart as your brown material, and the lower part of your chart down here as your green material, and this middle part is your balanced. So you're going to need to use this kind of material down here to balance that. Whoa, you lost me. It's too complicated. I'm not going to do it. Well, that's the tendency that some people might have is I'm not going to compost it. I'm going to fail because I can't keep straight 600 to 1, 17 to 1, how much of this, how much of that. Rule of thumb, and I kind of like this when I found it, is think about 1 part of the green stuff to 4 parts of the brown stuff, and then add air and water as it's needed or desired by the compost pile. And the compost pile will kind of talk to you, if you will, through your compost thermometer and through how hot and cool it's going. And again, we'll talk about that more in a moment. But 1 plus 4 equals compost. Think about that and try to remember that simple thing. Again, back to this chart that I said earlier. You've got your green, you've got your brown, you've got your balanced. So 1 plus 4, and so on. Okay, if I had everything I needed, if I had air and food and water, but you put me out in a Nebraska field where it's cold, I'd have the 3 things that I need, but there's really one other thing that I would need out there or that a compost pile needs, and for lack of a better term, I've decided to call this the right habitat. The right habitat is important for effective hot composting. As I said, you could have all 3 of the other things, but if you don't have your suitable habitat, it's going to be a struggle for your pile. So think of it this way, in a word picture. Your hot composting habitat is 1 cubic yard of mounded or contained material. And a cubic yard is nothing more than 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 3 feet high. And unless you have a container, it's probably going to be mounded. But the important part is you need to create this habitat, and it's generally going to be in a pile or a mound that has a cubic yard or so. So again, back to how to compost. A compost bin of some sort is going to maintain and contain a cubic yard a whole lot easier than maybe just having a pile that will spread out. And what I've learned and what we experienced early on when we were doing composting is you could have maybe a cubic yard mounded, but you've got these tailing ends off of the mound that are far from being 1 cubic yard deep or a yard deep, and those are cold. They just don't have that nuclear I'll use that term, nuclear reaction, or that biologic chemistry and temperature that happens in the core of your cubic yard. So you need to keep bringing those in. But if you have some kind of bin, it'll make it easier. And there's lots. This is just a few examples of many things that are out there. But there's tubs, and there's boxes, and there's barrels, there's tumblers, and they all have positives and negatives. Some of these you kind of put things together, and it's like this tub right here is kind of a one and done thing. You take all your materials and you put them in there, and you're not going to be adding too much more. You're going to need to turn that, which could be problematic. Also, you're going to have just the downward pressure and different things happening in a container that you might not have in a bin. So, but it keeps it nice and tidy. Again, and you have the same thing with a box, same thing with a tumbler. This is off of the ground. It's also out of reach, a little more so for rodents and other things that could be a problem in your compost pile. And then you've got something of this sort too that works okay. But my preference is to do a compost pile with pallets. It works, and it was free. Remembering what Tom Peterson said, it takes, in this case, it took 7 pallets for a 3-bin compost pile, and a couple pieces of plywood that were laying around from a house that we bought that had been used as a concrete forms, some hinges that I had in my hardware drawer, and some cinder blocks that I had acquired from different places over the course of years. And you can see down here how the hinge is on the back of the bin so that the plywood can go up and down to cover the pile when it needs to be covered, and to cover it to keep it from getting too wet or too dry. The different bins that we've had have been an evolutionary process. Years ago, we did just a pile. And then at one point, about 30 years ago, I went out and bought about $100 worth of cedar lumber fencing and made something of this sort, but made it with cedar fencing. And we've used these hay bales, not just on the front, but on the walls and on the back. And they worked, but they break down, which is a good thing, except for if you're using them for your front wall. They become an issue to move if you're going to get in here and turn your pile. So where I have settled and what works for me, but how you choose to use a compost bin or a box is up to you. But this is what works for me, is pallets and cinder blocks, and I've moved away from this procedure right here. And talk about tools. It's your choice, and whatever works for you. Don't want to discourage you. Just want to show you what works for me. And these are some things that will help you get started. You're going to need your materials from around your yard, so a rake is going to be helpful. And a leaf blower is helpful if you've got a driveway or a patio. A pitchfork, if I needed to go to just one hand tool for my compost pile, it might be a pitchfork. I find it extremely helpful for picking up material off and then putting it into a wheelbarrow, whether it's off a patio once it's in a pile or out of the yard. And then it's my go-to tool for turning my pile to keep it aerated. The shovel's helpful for when you get to the end of the pile and you want to get that last little bit as you're turning it to go into the next side or to turn on itself. A hose and a nozzle is going to be important to keep your pile moist. And then what you see right here, and I don't have a better shot than this, I apologize for that, but that's a compost thermometer. You'll see the dial here in a few shots, but it's got maybe a 2-foot stinger on it, so you can push it into your compost pile and get a reading on what's happening on that core of your pile and what's happening on the edges. And it's what your compost pile speaks to you with. It'll tell you what's going on and if you need to manage it and how happy your pile is. Here's a wheelbarrow that I prefer. You can use a contractor's wheelbarrow or something smaller or even a garden cart. But this is a 2-wheeled wheelbarrow. It doesn't tip over. It holds about twice as much as a contractor's wheelbarrow. And it's what I've settled on. Comes in handy to bring in the material or to move things around. And I'll speak to a tool. I think it's this one right here. It's a screen that we use if we want to sift our compost to make it a little finer, especially if you're going to use it to substitute for park dust or something like that. This tool is pretty handy for that. It's dimensioned so that it fits right over the top of the wheelbarrow. And so I park the wheelbarrow next to the pile and we shovel the material into that. And then I wish it was as easy as the archaeologists who just shake it and all the dust comes through and all the bigger material stays on top. It's not quite that easy. You end up stirring it with a scoop shovel or a piece of 2x4 or something, and all the finer stuff falls into your wheelbarrow. And I just tip it up, and whatever's left, the coarser stuff, just goes right back into, as brown material, into a working bin that I've got going. I love a lawnmower for lots of reasons. It makes a job a lot easier when it comes to raking, and you'll see that in a moment. But it also has a few things that I've recently done that are really sweet. Here's our front yard last October, and we have a big maple tree out there that drops a lot of leaves, and I wasn't done after this. I think we had to go back several times and continued to use the lawnmower until the lawn got too wet to have the wheels out on it. But in 10 minutes of just going in a circle around and round and round with the bag on it, I got all these things cleaned up, and I ended up with some really nice material for the compost pile. Almost where I want it in terms of how much green material, the nitrogen-bearing material to the brown material, and it reduced the particle size, which is a big factor, especially with leaves, because they tend to get nasty in a compost pile. They mat down and just become like wet newspaper. And so to break them up like this and then have it pre-stirred, you just dump this right into the compost pile. But not all your leaves fall on your lawn. You've got some that are in your garden, some that are on your patio, and you end up raking things up. And so here is a pile of dried leaves before mulching. And here is the same pile. That's before, and that's after I ran over it with the lawnmower without the mower bag on there. And I'm going to test the limits of our bandwidth here and see if I can make this happen. See if I can replay it again. I have about a minute of this, but the file size was too big. So you get the idea. This worked well with dried leaves. I did it this spring with some wet leaves, and it worked. You just had to be a lot slower at how you work through the pile because you bogged down the engine and it'd stall, but it did work. And this material is diamonds in your compost pile. You put that in with some green material or the higher nitrogen material. It's great. It's a nice bulking agent. If your pile is wet, it tends to kind of dry things out unless you moisten this stuff down a lot. In the particle size, you've got a lot more surface area that comes in contact with the other material. So it breaks down nicely. This is one of the helpful hints that I wish I'd known years ago. And so I share it with you to maybe this is something that you could do. So how do I compost? Well, you just got to start. But last October, it was helpful to have all the material in our utility yard kind of staged and ready to go into the pile. And I'll add that that's one drawback then to having kind of this size, this scale of compost pile, is it takes some space, unlike some of those tumblers or some of those tubs where you can compost in a smaller area. You're going to use up some space to do this. But I gathered up all the material, and I go, oh boy, I got all this material. How do I proportion it? And after doing this for some years and watching what happens with the thermometer, we've kind of gotten a little bit of a feel for what happens. Remembering there's a science behind this, but there's kind of an art behind this too, that you can pretty much fall back to a simpler recipe and start compiling your compost pile. Remembering that as you build it up, you need to keep it moist. And Kathy's there with a nozzle, and about every 4 inches or so as I built things up, we give it a good spray, keeping in mind you don't want too much or too little, the wet sponge concept. And here's not a time lapse, but some photo points of that pile. This is what it looked like the first day. It was basically air temperature. It was 55 degrees. And this is the dial of the compost pile, or compost thermometer. The second day, you can see, oh, the little guys are getting fed and they're getting active. We're up to 84 degrees on the second day. On the fourth day, it went to 132, and it stayed there for a while. We've had our compost up to 150, and probably this is where the precision of building a compost pile versus kind of just throwing it together with a basic one part this and X parts this. If you did it more precisely, you could get to 150 plus and maintain it there. We got to 132 and about November 1st. On the 8th day, it started to drop off. We are down to 119 degrees, which is still things are happening. You wouldn't want to be at 119 and call that a hot compost for purposes of dealing with your weed seeds and things like that. But it's definitely biologically active and things are breaking down. But something happened by that 8th day to go from 132 down to 119. So think again of the stool. What does a pile need? It needs air, it needs food, and it needs water, and it needs a habitat. Well, I know that it had food. Maybe it could have been a little more balanced. I know that it was damp because I could feel it. But the pile had collapsed on itself by almost 50%. So what that is telling me is probably I'm starting to use up the available oxygen that's in the voids within the inner part of the pile. And because it had collapsed to half of its original height, which was about 3 feet, its ideal habitat of that 1 cubic yard is becoming a little less ideal. So that's the 8th day. Then we went out of town and we came back, and 25 days later it was looking like this. It's looking more like compost and less like the individual materials that were making up the pile. And then if you look close, this is what was happening inside. The temperature had dropped down to a point where we started to have worms coming in there, and this is what we could see of what was happening. But we didn't put the worms there. They came. If you build it, they will come. And they kind of, if you have 3 compost piles, they kind of migrate back and forth to find the temperature and the food sources and the habitat that they like. And they obviously liked this pile 25 days later, which leads me to a commercial for worm composting. I think it's tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. So if you're interested in worm composting, keep that in mind. So that's 25 days later. Here's 5 months later. Now this is not all the compost. It's not all compost from that pile, but we did use it in this raised bed where we have some onion sets mixed in with some other soil that we had, and then I had sifted some compost at one point and used it as the top dressing for these flowers. So maybe, I hope I've answered your question, or this question for you, of why bother to compost. Whether it's any of those reasons before or other reasons that I didn't bring up. There is a reason to compost, and it's an individual choice, but there's some definite benefits from it. And I hope I've encouraged you to think about it, and I hope I've made it less complex than it needs to be to start. And I'd encourage you just to start and get going on it. Learn as you go. Watch your thermometer, and it's going to tell you what you need to do. And think of the benefits. I like the idea of, we haven't had garbage service for some time because we compost almost everything we can. And everything that we can't compost, we take down to our daughter's place in Hillsboro and throw it in her garbage. But even so, we're down to a couple of grocery plastic sacks every couple of weeks. It's made that big a difference for our waste stream out of our household. So you saw some of these before, but these are some resources that are available and that I used to put this together. I'll say thanks to Art Fuller for a presentation he put together that I borrowed from, and also these other sources. And these are kind of intermediate, and there's much more technical resources that are out there as well if you want to go into the biology and the chemistry of what's going on. So with that, I'll end with this, one of my favorite pictures of my wife and our oldest grandchild, only grandchild at the time, Alexa, who is learning the tricks of the trade of gardening from her master gardener grandmother. So that's what I have, and we can open it up for questions now.